"I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair, voice breaking completely. "For the first time in 15 years, Katerina, I took up arms for someone. Not for power, not for my family's business, not for revenge. For you. Only for you." You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Dark Romance Stories channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The third body arrived at Northwestern Memorial at 4:47 in the morning, and Dr. Caterina Bellini knew before she even looked at the chart that something was wrong with the world again. His name was Walter Hines, 61 years old, a retired postal worker with a wife named Donna, who sat in the family room twisting a tissue into a wet rope. He'd been on lisinopril and a generic cardiac maintenance drug called Cortisol for 11 months. He had come into the ER complaining of chest tightness and dizziness, and 40 minutes later, his heart had simply stopped trying. Katerina had seen 2 patients like this in the last 6 weeks, both older, both on Cortisol, both with labs that made no clinical sense. Potassium levels that spiked without explanation, liver enzymes that told a story no cardiologist wanted to read. She stood over Walter Hines's chart at the nurses' station long after the code had been called, after the resident who'd run it had gone to find coffee and a place to cry where no one could see him. She wasn't supposed to be doing detective work. She was a third-year resident with a dissertation deadline and an attending who thought she asked too many questions in rounds. But 3 deaths in 6 weeks, 3 patients on the same medication, 3 families who would never know why. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a pattern. And patterns were the only language Caterina Bellini had ever fully trusted. "You're still here," said Priya, the night charge nurse, passing with a tray of empty syringes. "Go home, Kat. You look like you got hit by the L train." "Pull me the batch numbers on the Cortisol from the pharmacy log," Katerina said instead. "All 3 patients. I want to know if they're from the same lot." Priya raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Nobody really argued with Katerina once she had that look, the one that made her dark eyes go very still, like a lake right before a storm decides whether or not to break. "You think it's the meds?" "I think 3 deaths from the same supposedly safe drug in 6 weeks isn't medicine. It's math. And the math doesn't add up." She didn't sleep that night. She went home to her studio apartment in Pilsen, the one with the exposed brick her mother insisted made it look unfinished, made coffee she didn't drink, and pulled up every public filing she could find on Cortisol's manufacturer. A company called Meridian Pharma, headquartered in a glass tower on North Michigan Avenue, with a parent holding company registered in Naples, Italy, and a CEO whose name she had never heard before that night and would never be able to forget again. Lorenzo Camorra. She typed the name into a search bar, the way you might press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. The press photo showed a man in his late 30s, dark hair threaded with the first silver, a jaw that looked like it had been built specifically to say no to things. Profiles called him a philanthropist, a self-made pharmaceutical innovator, a man who had brought affordable cardiac medication to underserved communities across the Midwest. There was a photograph of him cutting a ribbon at a children's clinic in Cicero, smiling the practiced smile of a man who had learned a long time ago that smiling cost nothing and bought everything. Katerina had spent 4 years of medical school being taught to trust data over instinct. But something about that photograph, about the particular stillness behind that smile, made the lake inside her go dark and quiet. By morning she had the batch numbers. All 3 patients, Walter Hines and the 2 before him, Loretta Vance and a man named Dwight Okafor, had received medication from the same production lot, ML-2291, manufactured at a Meridian Pharma facility that, according to public FDA registries, didn't actually exist at the address listed on the label. A counterfeit lot, sold as the real drug, filtered into hospital pharmacy systems through channels that should have been impossible to breach. She brought it to her attending, Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, who looked at her printouts the way a tired parent looks at a child who has drawn on the walls again. Katerina. You are a third-year resident. This is an FDA matter, a DEA matter, possibly an FBI matter. It is not a research project matter, and it is certainly not a girl with a laptop at 3 a.m. matter. 3 people are dead, and you bringing me unverified batch numbers from a pharmacy log you weren't authorized to pull will not bring them back. It will get you fired. He'd softened then, because underneath the exhaustion he liked her. Almost everyone did eventually, once they got past the wall of intensity she carried like a second white coat. File it through compliance, properly. Let the system work. The system, Katerina had learned in 4 years of medicine, worked exactly as fast as the people inside it wanted it to, which was to say, not fast enough for Walter Hines, or Loretta Vance, or Dwight Okafor. So she did what she always did when the system moved too slowly. She went around it. It took her 11 days of after-shift surveillance, 2 bribed parking attendants, and 1 extremely illegal late-night visit to a public records office to trace the supply chain backward from the hospital pharmacy's wholesale distributor to a warehouse on the south side in an industrial corridor near the river where streetlights went to die and nobody asked questions about trucks that came and went after midnight without DOT numbers that matched their manifests. She told herself she was only going to look, document the trucks, the timestamps, maybe a license plate. She had a camera. She had a press badge from her cousin who worked for the Sun-Times that she was absolutely not authorized to use. She had, she would later admit, an enormous amount of stupid, righteous courage and almost no actual plan. She did not expect the warehouse door to be unlocked. She did not expect to find herself 20 minutes later standing in a forest of pallets stacked floor to ceiling with boxes stamped Corvusol, Meridian Pharma, Lot ML-2291. Her phone's camera light the only thing illuminating the dark, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And she did not expect the voice that came out of the shadows behind her, low and amused and utterly without fear, to say the words that would end her old life and begin everything else. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," the voice said, "or the stupidest. I haven't decided which yet." She spun, phone light swinging, and found herself looking at a man who had clearly been standing there, unmoving, watching her for longer than she wanted to think about. Tall, dark coat over a dark suit, no tie, top button of his shirt undone like he'd taken it off himself in irritation hours ago. He had the kind of face that made you understand, instantly and physically, why people used the word dangerous as a compliment in certain rooms. She knew him before he said his name. She'd memorized the photograph. "Lorenzo Camorra," she said, and her voice, to her own enormous private relief, did not shake. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise, maybe, or interest, which she would learn much later was a far more dangerous thing to put behind those particular eyes than fear. "And you are," he said, taking one slow step closer, "trespassing in my warehouse at 1 in the morning with a phone full of photographs that could get you killed by men far less patient than I am." "I know you're killing people," Katerina said. The words came out of her before she'd decided to say them, raw and unprotected, the way truth sometimes escapes a person before strategy can catch up to it. She watched them land on him like a slap. For a long moment, Lorenzo Camorra said nothing at all. Behind him, in the dark of the warehouse, she could hear the low hum of a refrigeration unit, the drip of something she didn't want to identify, the particular silence of a man deciding what kind of night this was going to be. "Do you?" he said finally, and there was no anger in it. Worse than anger, there was curiosity. "Tell me, Dr. Bellini." He said her name like he'd known it before she'd known his. "What exactly do you think you know?" He knew her name. That single fact detonated somewhere behind Katerina's ribs with more force than any threat could have. "You've been investigating me," he said, reading the realization on her face with an ease that made her skin crawl. Katerina Bellini, third-year resident, Northwestern Memorial, writing a dissertation on counterfeit pharmaceutical infiltration into public hospital systems, a very ambitious topic for someone who apparently doesn't understand the concept of personal safety. He tilted his head. "I had Marco run your name 2 days after you first pulled those batch records. Did you think a pharmacy log query goes unnoticed in a hospital I have people inside of?" The floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath her. "You have people inside the hospital?" "I have people inside a great many places, Dottoressa." He said the Italian honorific with a faint private warmth, as if it were a door he was choosing deliberately to leave open between them. "It is how men like me survive long enough to wear good suits and give interviews about philanthropy." She made herself stand still, though every instinct screamed to run, and the warehouse offered nowhere to run to. "Then you know I have copies of everything. The batch numbers, the photographs, the supply chain documents. If something happens to me—" "If something happened to you," he interrupted, not unkindly, "it would not be by my hand, and it would not be tonight. And you would know that already if you had done even slightly more research before breaking into a building owned by a man whose family has been called, by people far less polite than journalists, animals." He took another step, close enough now that she could see the fine, controlled tension in his jaw, the way his eyes moved over her face like he was reading a language only he understood. "I am going to ask you a question, and I would advise you to answer honestly, because I have an excellent ear for lies and a very short patience for liars. Ask. Why didn't you call the police, instead of climbing through a warehouse window at 1 in the morning like a burglar in a film?" The honest answer arrived before she could stop it. "Because 3 people are dead, and the police take months. Because the FDA takes years. Because somewhere in a filing cabinet there's a report about Lot ML-2291 gathering dust while you ship out Lot ML-2292, and I don't have months, and neither does the next person who fills that prescription." Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration, as if she'd answered a test he hadn't expected her to pass. "You came here to stop me." "I came here to find proof." "And what will you do?" he asked, voice dropping lower, almost gentle now. "With proof that the man standing in front of you controls a pharmaceutical empire that launders product through 3 countries and a charitable foundation. Print it in your dissertation? Email it to the FDA's tip line? Tell me, Katerina, what does the truth weigh, exactly, against men who have already decided it is inconvenient for them?" "More than you think," she said, "because I'm not the only one who's noticed. There were 3 deaths in 6 weeks. Someone else will notice the 4th. A long silence. Somewhere a forklift's hydraulics hissed and settled. Lorenzo studied her with the particular stillness of a predator, deciding whether the animal in front of him was prey worth the trouble or something else entirely. Something he had not expected to find in a cold warehouse on a Tuesday night. "There won't be a 4th, he said finally. "Excuse me?" Lot ML-2291 was not supposed to leave the production facility. It was intercepted, diverted by people working for this organization without my authorization, sold into legitimate supply chains by men I am, as we speak, in the process of finding and removing. I did not order 3 deaths, Dottoressa. I do not deal in counterfeit cardiac medication that kills postal workers and grandmothers. Whatever you believe a man like me to be, you should know precisely what I am before you decide how much to hate me for it." Katerina stared at him, trying to find the lie in his face, and finding instead something that frightened her infinitely more. Conviction. "You expect me to believe you?" "I expect nothing from you, except what you've already shown me tonight, that you are smarter than the situation you've put yourself in, and braver than is good for either of us." He reached into his coat. She flinched, and he noticed, and something flickered across his face that might have been the first genuine regret she'd seen from him, and withdrew not a weapon, but a card, plain white, a single phone number embossed in black. "I am going to make you an offer, and you are going to listen to the entire thing before you say no. Because saying no to half an offer is how stupid people get themselves killed. And you, Dr. Bellini, despite tonight's evidence to the contrary, do not strike me as stupid." "I'm listening." "You will say nothing of what you found here tonight? No reports, no leaks, no late-night calls to journalist cousins with stolen press badges?" She startled. He smiled, just slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it did something unforgivable to the rhythm of her heart. "Yes, I know about the badge too. In exchange, I will personally halt every shipment from the contaminated lot, recall what has already gone out through channels you do not have access to, and I will fund, fully, publicly, in your hospital's name, the entire pediatric cardiac unit at Northwestern Memorial. Equipment, staffing, a research grant in your name, if you want it, for the dissertation you are clearly far too talented to abandon." "You're trying to buy my silence." "I am trying," he said, "to give 3 families an explanation that doesn't end in years of litigation that goes nowhere, and to give a hospital full of sick children a unit that currently doesn't exist. Call it whatever serves your conscience best." "And if I say no? If I go to the FBI tomorrow?" His expression didn't change, but something in the air around him did, a drop in temperature she felt in her spine. Then you will discover exactly how thin the line is between the man standing in front of you, who is, despite everything, trying to do the right thing, the only way men like me know how, and the family I come from, who will not extend you the same courtesy twice. It was not quite a threat, it was worse. It was an honest warning, delivered by a man who clearly believed every word of it, including the parts that should have terrified her far more than they did. "I want it in writing," she said. "The funding, publicly announced within 30 days. Something that was almost pride moved across his face. "Done. And I want to know who diverted that lot. The real people responsible. Not for my dissertation. For Walter Hines' wife." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a man studies a painting he didn't expect to find in a building he owns. "You will have a name," he said, "when it is safe to give you one, not before." She took the card. It felt heavier than white paper had any right to feel. "This doesn't make us friends," she said. "No," he agreed, and the smile returned, slower this time, more dangerous. "It doesn't make us anything at all, Dottoressa. Yet." True to his word, the announcement came on day 26. Katerina was in the resident lounge, eating a sad vending machine sandwich, when the hospital's internal newsletter pinged her phone. Meridian Pharma Foundation announces $4. $2 million gift to establish Northwestern Memorial Pediatric Cardiac Unit. There was a photograph of the hospital's CEO shaking hands with a man in a charcoal suit whose smile, in print, looked exactly like every other corporate philanthropist's smile. Practiced, warm, empty of anything that might give away the truth of what he'd looked like standing in a dark warehouse telling her, "I do not deal in counterfeit cardiac medication that kills postal workers and grandmothers." Like a vow. She told herself she felt nothing reading it. She told herself a great many things over the next 2 weeks, most of them lies. The truth was that she could not stop thinking about him. Not the danger of him, exactly, though that lived in her chest like a held breath, but the strangeness of him. A mafia boss who flinched, almost imperceptibly, when she'd flinched from his hand. A man who'd offered her a name for Walter Hines' widow before she'd even asked for one for herself. A man whose voice, when he said "Dottoressa," made something low and unwilling in her stomach turn over. It was 3 weeks before she heard from him again. She was leaving a 12-hour shift, half asleep on her feet, fumbling for her car keys in the hospital parking garage, when a black sedan with windows tinted dark enough to be its own small kingdom pulled up beside her with the silent confidence of money that never had to ask permission to exist. The back window lowered 6 inches. "Get in," Lorenzo said. "Or don't. But I would prefer the conversation we're about to have not happen in a parking garage with a working security camera every 40 feet. I have my own car. Marco will drive it to your apartment. He's very good with cars. Better than he is with people, frankly, but you'll learn to appreciate his particular talents." A beat. "Katerina, get in the car." She should have said no. She would think later about all the moments in this story where she should have said no, and she would understand that the truest thing about falling for a dangerous man was never the single moment of surrender. It was the long, slow accumulation of 100 small moments where you could have walked away and didn't, because some treacherous, unscientific part of you had already decided the danger was worth it. She got in the car. He looked different up close, in the dim gold light of the sedan's interior. Tired, she realized with surprise. The controlled stillness she'd seen in the warehouse cracked just slightly at the edges, like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "You found the name," she guessed. "I found several names." He handed her a folder, slim, unmarked. The man who diverted lot ML-2291 was a regional distribution manager named Salvatore Greco. He sold the counterfeit batch to a black market broker for less money than I pay my driver in a month, because he believed, correctly as it turns out, that I would never notice a single lot among thousands. His jaw tightened. He has been dealt with. Something cold moved through her. Dealt with how? He will not be diverting any more pharmaceutical shipments, Katerina. That is all the detail you require, and all the detail I am willing to give a doctor who took an oath to do no harm. His eyes found hers in the dim light, steady, almost daring her to ask the question underneath the question, "Did you kill him?" And she found, to her own quiet horror, that she didn't actually want the answer badly enough to ask. What you will find in that folder is everything Walter Hines' widow needs to understand what happened to her husband, framed in language a grieving woman can survive reading. There is also a number for a foundation that will cover funeral costs and ongoing financial support for both surviving families, structured so that no money trail ever touches my name or yours. She opened the folder, read. Found, exactly as promised, the truth told gently, the way you'd explain death to someone you actually cared about, sparing further pain. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, looking up. "The real reason, not the press release reason." Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, looking out the tinted window at the grey Chicago night sliding past, streetlights smearing gold across his profile. When he spoke, his voice had lost its careful polish, gone rougher, lower, more dangerous in its honesty than anything he'd said in the warehouse. "Because once," he said, "a long time ago, someone I loved more than my own life took a medication that was supposed to save her, and it killed her instead. And I have spent every year since then making sure that the empire built on top of that grief never, ever does to another family what was done to mine." He turned to look at her, and whatever mask he wore for boardrooms and ribbon cuttings had slipped entirely away, leaving something raw and old and very tired underneath. "You wanted to know what I am, Dottoressa. That is what I am. A man trying to control a fire he didn't start, in a house that's been burning for 15 years. The car had stopped outside her apartment building without her noticing. Neither of them moved to end the silence that followed. "Who was she?" Katerina asked softly. "The person you loved." His eyes went somewhere far away, somewhere she understood instinctively she had not yet earned the right to follow him to. "Another night," he said, "if there is one." He reached past her to open the door himself, his arm brushing hers, close enough that she caught the low, expensive warmth of his cologne and something underneath it that was simply him. And for one suspended second, neither of them moved, the question of whether there would be another night hanging unanswered between them like smoke that hadn't decided which direction to drift. "Good night, Katerina," he said finally, voice rough. She got out of the car. She did not look back, though every nerve in her body wanted to. It was only once she was inside her apartment, leaning against her own front door with her heart going far too fast for a woman who had simply ridden home in a car, that she let herself admit the truth she'd been out running since the warehouse. She wanted there to be another night. Badly, recklessly, in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with her dissertation and everything to do with the particular ache of watching a dangerous man's careful mask slip, just once, just for her. There were, Katerina told herself, perfectly clinical reasons to keep seeing him. He had information she needed, names, dates, the architecture of a counterfeit pharmaceutical pipeline that stretched from Naples to Chicago to half a dozen cities she hadn't even mapped yet. If she was going to write a dissertation that actually mattered, that actually changed something, she needed a source inside the machine. It had nothing to do with the warmth of his voice on the phone at midnight, or the way he'd started texting her articles about cardiac pharmacology with single-line commentary that made her laugh out loud in the resident lounge, or the increasingly embarrassing amount of time she spent deciding what to wear to meetings that were, officially, research interviews. She told herself this for 6 weeks, through 4 research interviews that became dinners, through one terrifying afternoon when he picked her up from a 12-hour shift with takeout from a restaurant that didn't have a public phone number, through the slow erosion of every professional boundary she'd built her entire adult identity around. "You're investigating him from the inside," she told her reflection one night, testing how the lie sounded out loud. "That's all this is." Her reflection did not look convinced. Neither, if she was honest, was she. The dinners were the worst, or the best, depending on which version of herself was doing the judging. He took her to a restaurant in the West Loop, with no sign on the door, where the staff called him Don Camorra in low, deferential voices, and seated them at a corner table, angled so his back was always to the wall, and his eyes were always on the room. He ordered for both of them in Italian, without asking, and when she'd raised an eyebrow at the presumption, he'd simply said, "I am told I have excellent taste," with a half smile that made the presumption entirely forgivable. "Tell me about her," Katerina said, halfway through a glass of wine. She was nursing slower than she wanted to, because she needed her wits about her around this man more than she'd ever needed them around anyone. "The person who died. You said you'd tell me. Another night." Lorenzo set down his fork with the careful precision of a man buying himself time. "Sophia," he said finally. "My daughter." The word landed in Katerina's chest like a stone dropped into still water. "You're Lorenzo. I didn't know you had a daughter." "Had," he corrected, very quietly. "She would be 21 this year." He turned his wineglass by the stem, not drinking, watching the dark liquid catch the candlelight. "She was 6. A fever, nothing dramatic. The kind of thing children survive 1,000 times a day. The hospital gave her a standard antipyretic, over the counter, completely unremarkable, except the batch had been cut with an industrial filler to stretch profit margins, and her small body could not process what should have been a perfectly safe dose of medicine that was never actually what the label claimed it to be. Katerina's hand found his across the table before her mind had finished deciding to move it. "Lorenzo, I'm so sorry." "I was 24, he continued, voice flat in the particular way of a man who has told this story to himself so many times it no longer bleeds when he opens it, only aches. My father had been grooming me to take over the legitimate side of the family's pharmaceutical interests. Distribution, mostly, some manufacturing. I thought it was a businessman's life. Boring. Respectable. I did not understand until I was holding my daughter's body in a hospital corridor in Naples that the entire industry my family had quietly bought its way into for 2 generations was riddled with exactly the kind of counterfeit, corner-cutting poison that had just killed her. His eyes lifted to Katerina's, dark and old, with a grief that had clearly never finished happening to him. So I made a choice. I could walk away, become legitimate, let other men's daughters die from the same poison while I slept soundly in a clean conscience I'd bought with my distance. Or I could go further inside the machine than my father ever had. Control it. Weaponize it. Use every brutal tool my family's name afforded me to hunt down the men who sell counterfeit medication and make absolutely certain they never sell it again. That's not a justification for organized crime, Katerina said softly. I need you to understand. I know that. I know what you are, what your family does, that pediatric wings and recalled lots don't erase the rest of it. I am not asking you to erase it, Lorenzo said. I am asking you to understand it. There is a difference, Dottoressa, and you are far too intelligent not to know it. He turned his hand beneath hers, so they were properly holding hands across the white tablecloth in a restaurant with no sign on the door, and something about the gesture felt more dangerous than every gun she suspected was hidden in the room. I have killed men, Katerina. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I have never once, in 15 years, allowed a counterfeit drug to reach a hospital under my control without burning the supply chain that produced it to the ground. And I never will, because I buried my daughter in a coffin too small for the silence I have carried ever since. She should have pulled her hand back. She thought about it, genuinely, clinically considered it, the way she considered every dangerous variable in her life, and found that she didn't want to. Why are you telling me this? She asked. All of it, the real version, not the press release version. Because you came to a warehouse alone in the middle of the night and looked a man capable of killing you directly in the eye and told him the truth instead of begging for your life, Lorenzo said, voice dropping into something rougher, more honest than she'd ever heard from him. Because I have spent 15 years surrounded by people who tell me exactly what I want to hear. And you are the first person in longer than I can remember who has told me only what is true. His thumb traced once, slow and deliberate, across her knuckles. Because I think, Dottoressa, against every instinct I have spent a lifetime perfecting, that I am beginning to fall in love with you, and I find I am no longer interested in pretending I am not. The restaurant noise seemed to recede to a great distance. Katerina sat very still, heart hammering, the careful, clinical distance she'd been constructing for 6 weeks, collapsing all at once like a building with its foundation finally given out. That's a problem, she said, voice not quite steady, because I think I might be falling for you too, and I have absolutely no idea what to do about that. Neither do I, Lorenzo admitted, and for the first time since the warehouse, she saw something that looked almost like fear cross his face. Not of her, she understood, but of exactly how much he had just allowed himself to want. But I find, for the first time in 15 years, that I am willing to find out. Falling for Lorenzo Camorra, Caterina was discovering, came with a syllabus she had never agreed to enroll in. There were rules now, unspoken at first, then increasingly spoken, delivered in the calm, absolute cadence of a man who had survived this long precisely because he left nothing to chance. She was never to meet him at the same restaurant twice in 1 month. She was never to text him anything specific about timing or location. Marco, his driver, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, would simply appear, as if summoned by atmosphere alone, exactly when and where she was needed. She was never, under any circumstances, to mention his full name in a public place, not even in a hospital cafeteria 3 miles from anywhere that mattered. "You're being paranoid," she told him one night, lying with her head on his chest, in the penthouse he kept on the 61st floor of a building whose name she'd been instructed never to say out loud. The city spread beneath them in a glittering, indifferent grid. "I am being alive," he corrected, fingers moving slowly through her hair in a way that had become over the past month the single most reliable cure for the chaos of 12-hour shifts she had ever discovered. "There is a difference between the two, that men in my family learn early, or they do not learn it at all, because they are buried before the lesson takes." "Is that a joke?" "It is the least funny true thing I have ever said to you." He shifted, propping himself on one elbow to look down at her, and even now, a month into whatever this had become, the sheer intensity of his attention still did something physically destabilizing to her pulse. There are families who would consider it a significant strategic opportunity to know that Lorenzo Camorra has fallen for a doctor with no protection, no security detail, and an apartment with a lock any teenager could pick in under a minute. "You've checked my lock. I had it replaced 3 weeks ago. You didn't notice because Marco is, as I mentioned, very good with things that aren't people." She sat up, pulling the sheet with her, half laughing, half genuinely unsettled. "Lorenzo, you can't just replace my locks without telling me." "I can," he said simply, "and I will continue to, because the alternative is a version of this story where someone uses you to get to me, and I have already buried one person I loved because I failed to protect her. I will not survive doing that twice." The humour had drained entirely from his voice, replaced by something low and fierce that she was beginning to recognize as the particular shape of his love, possessive, absolute, terrifying in its intensity, and utterly, devastatingly sincere. "You are mine now, Caterina. I do not say that to claim you like property. I say it because it is the only word large enough for what I feel when I think about anything happening to you, and I am not a poet, so it is the best I have." She should have been afraid of a man who spoke about her like an asset to be secured. Instead, lying in his bed 61 stories above a city that had no idea what was happening in this particular glass tower, she found herself believing him completely, and worse, wanting to be claimed exactly this thoroughly by exactly this man. "I want to see your work," she said instead, because some part of her, the doctor, the researcher, the woman who had broken into a warehouse alone in the dark, still needed evidence, even now. "The real version, not the foundation, not the ribbon cuttings. I want to understand what you actually do, every day, to keep this promise you made me about counterfeit medication." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't name. "That is a significant request." "I'm a significant person to make it to." A slow, reluctant smile broke across his face, the rare, real one, the one that still made her chest ache every time she earned it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will show you the part of my life I show almost no one. And then, Katerina, you will understand precisely what you have fallen in love with, and I will understand whether you are brave enough to stay." The next afternoon, Marco drove them to a nondescript office building in River North, the kind of building you walked past 1,000 times without ever wondering what happened on its upper floors. Inside, behind 3 separate security checkpoints and a door that required both a keycard and Lorenzo's thumbprint, was a war room that looked nothing like the glamorous penthouse she'd grown accustomed to. Fluorescent lights, whiteboards covered in supply chain diagrams, 6 analysts in shirt sleeves tracking shipment manifests across half the globe in real time. "This is Meridian Pharma's actual operation," Lorenzo said, leading her past a wall of monitors tracking cargo containers across an interactive map. Not the corporate floor with the marble lobby. This is where we trace every batch of legitimate medication from raw ingredient to pharmacy shelf, and where we hunt for the gaps, the places counterfeiters insert themselves into supply chains that should be airtight. He gestured to a woman bent over a terminal, fierce concentration on her face. "Elena runs forensic batch tracing. She found Salvatore Greco's diversion route in 9 days, which is, by industry standards, extraordinary." Katerina moved slowly through the room, watching analysts cross-reference shipping manifests against hospital intake logs, watching a man flag an anomalous batch number with the same intensity she'd watched residents flag abnormal labs. It was, she realized with a strange, vertiginous lurch, exactly the kind of work she'd spent her entire dissertation trying to do alone, with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the access, and none of the danger that came with actually being able to act on what you found. "This is real," she said softly. "This is actually real." "Did you think I was lying?" "I thought," she said carefully, "that I had fallen for a story you'd told me to make yourself easier to love. I didn't expect this, the scale of it, the seriousness." "I told you who I am, Katerina. I did not tell you a story." He came to stand beside her, close enough that the analysts in the room carefully, deliberately did not look at either of them. "This is what I do with the resources my family's darker business affords me. I cannot undo what we are. I cannot make my father's empire something it was never built to be. But I can build this, inside it. A wolf using its own teeth to protect the flock instead of feeding on it. It will never make me a good man, Dottoressa, but it is the closest thing to good I have left to offer." She turned to look at him, this man who killed and protected in the same breath, who had built a war room to honor a daughter he couldn't save, who looked at her now with an intensity that made the fluorescent-lit office feel suddenly dangerously intimate. "It's enough," she said quietly. "It's enough for me." Detective Marcus Webb of the Chicago field office had been building a file on Meridian Pharma for 14 months before he ever heard the name Caterina Bellini. And the moment he did, every instinct he'd spent 20 years sharpening went off like a struck match. "Run her again," he told his partner, Denise Alvarez, sliding a printout across their cramped shared desk. A grainy, long-lens photograph of Lorenzo Camora's hand resting at the small of a dark-haired woman's back, outside a restaurant with no sign. Third-year resident, Northwestern Memorial. Same hospital that just got a $4.2 million gift from the Meridian Pharma Foundation. Same hospital that, 6 weeks before the gift, had 3 suspicious cardiac deaths flagged internally and then quietly closed without DEA referral. Denise studied the photo, then the date stamp. You think she's a plant? Comora's people inside the hospital feeding intel? I think, Webb said slowly, that I've been watching Lorenzo Camorra for 14 months, and I have never once seen him touch a woman in public. Not a date, not an associate's wife at a gala, nothing. The man is a ghost when it comes to anything personal, which is exactly why an organised crime detective should find it very, very interesting that he's suddenly photographed with his hand on a doctor's back outside a restaurant his own family owns through 4 shell corporations. He tapped the photo. Either she's working for him, or she has no idea what she's involved in, and that makes her either the most valuable witness I will ever turn, or the next casualty in a war she doesn't know she's standing in the middle of. It took Webb 3 more weeks of careful, deniable surveillance to build a profile thick enough to act on. Caterina Bellini, he learned, had no criminal record. No known Mafia ties beyond the relationship that had clearly developed over the past 2 months, and this was the detail that made him sit back in his chair and rub his eyes for a long time. A dissertation in progress on exactly the counterfeit pharmaceutical pipeline his task force had spent over a year trying to crack from the outside. She wasn't a plant. She was something far more useful and far more dangerous to put in play. A woman with legitimate access, real expertise, and, based on 3 photographs that made Webb distinctly uncomfortable on a level that had nothing to do with the case, genuine, unguarded feelings for the man he intended to put away for the rest of his life. He requested the meeting through her hospital's HR department, framed as a routine compliance interview related to a pharmaceutical fraud inquiry. Vague enough not to spook her, specific enough to guarantee she'd show up. She arrived at the downtown Federal Building on a rainy Thursday afternoon between shifts, scrubs still visible under her coat, exhaustion etched into the set of her shoulders, and Webb felt the first genuine pang of guilt he'd allowed himself in this entire investigation. Dr. Bellini, thank you for coming in. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, watched her take it with the careful, slightly suspicious posture of someone who had grown up being told never to trust a man with a badge unless you'd vetted him personally. I'm Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI Organized Crime Division. I'd like to talk to you about Lorenzo Camorra. He watched every muscle in her face go carefully, professionally still. The exact stillness, he noted, of someone who had been coached, deliberately or instinctively, in how to control a room's read on her. I'm not sure what that has to do with hospital compliance. Nothing, Webb admitted. I used a pretext to get you in this room because I needed to talk to you somewhere I knew you couldn't be overheard or followed, and I apologize for the deception, but I think once I tell you what I know, you'll understand why. He slid a folder across the desk. 14 months of surveillance photographs, financial trace documents, a chart mapping the Camorra family's documented violence across 3 decades. I've been investigating Meridian Pharma and its parent organization for over a year. I know about the counterfeit pharmaceutical pipeline. I know about Lot ML-2291, and I know that you found it before my entire task force did, working alone, with nothing but a hunch and a hospital pharmacy log. Katerina's hand, reaching for the folder, went very still. How do you... Because I've also been watching the man you've apparently fallen for, Dr. Bellini, and I think it's time someone told you exactly who he is before you fall any further." Webb leaned forward, voice dropping into the register he reserved for the moments in his job he hated most, the moments where the truth was a weapon he had no choice but to use on someone who hadn't done anything to deserve being hurt by it. Lorenzo Camorra is the head of the most powerful organized crime family in the Midwest. His pediatric wing donation isn't generosity, it's laundering and reputation management on a scale most people can't even comprehend. His war room, yes, I know about the war room, isn't redemption. It's quality control on a multinational smuggling operation that moves not just counterfeit pharmaceuticals, but weapons, currency, and, according to 2 confidential informants I've spent 18 months protecting, human trafficking routes through the port of Naples that his family has controlled for 3 generations. The folder fell open. Caterina stared down at photographs she didn't want to see. Lorenzo at 26, standing over a body in an alley with the cold, professional stillness of a man who had done this before and would do it again. Lorenzo at 30, shaking hands with a senator whose campaign finance records, the attached document noted, didn't quite add up. Lorenzo, 6 months ago, at a restaurant with no sign on the door, his hand resting possessively at the small of her own back. "I love him," she heard herself say, the words arriving before she'd decided whether they were a confession or a defense. "I know," Webb said, and something in his voice was almost gentle. "That's exactly why I need your help." "No," Caterina said, for the 4th time, standing now, the folder of photographs still open on the desk between them, like an accusation neither of them could close. "Absolutely not. I'm not going to wear a wire into a man's home and feed you evidence to put him in prison for the rest of his life." "Then he'll do it to someone else's family instead of yours," Webb said. And there was no cruelty in it, only the flat, exhausted certainty of a man who had spent a career watching exactly this kind of devastation play out. "I'm not asking you to fabricate anything, Dr. Bellini. I'm asking you to keep doing exactly what you're already doing, being close to him. Except now you tell me what you see. Shipment dates, names, the location of the war room you've apparently already toured." He saw her flinch and pressed forward anyway, because that was the job. Because somewhere a 4th Walter Hines was waiting in a pharmacy line that hadn't been shut down yet. "You came to me, to this entire investigation, because 3 patients died from a counterfeit drug his organization manufactured. Don't let yourself forget that part, because the man holding your hand across a candlelit table happened to be charming about his daughter's death." The mention of Sophia landed like a slap. "Don't," Caterina said, voice low and dangerous, in a way she hadn't known she possessed. "Don't use his daughter against him in this office. You don't get to weaponize a 6-year-old's death because it's strategically useful." "I'm not weaponizing it," Webb said quietly. "I'm telling you it's true. And it's also true that grief doesn't excuse what he's built on top of it. Both things can be real at once, Caterina. That's the entire, impossible shape of this case." She left the federal building that afternoon without agreeing to anything, walked 4 miles in cold rain rather than call Marco for a ride, and arrived back at her apartment, soaked through and shaking with something that wasn't entirely the cold. She did not call Lorenzo that night. She sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and tried, for the first time in 2 months, to hold both versions of him in her mind at once. The man who'd held her hand across white tablecloth and confessed his daughter's death like a wound that had never closed. And the man in a 14-month-old surveillance photograph, standing over a body with no visible emotion at all. It was her brother who finally forced the choice 2 days later, arriving unannounced at her apartment with the particular grim energy of a man who'd already decided how the conversation was going to go before he knocked. Wait. Katerina did not have a brother in this story. It was Webb himself who returned the following week with an ultimatum dressed as a request. "I need an answer," Webb said, standing in her doorway, rain-damp coat dripping onto her welcome mat, his face carrying none of the careful gentleness from their first meeting. "We have a wiretap warrant approved for a Camorra associate scheduled to expire in 6 days. If it lapses without new evidence, the entire task force loses momentum we've spent 14 months building, and the next counterfeit batch that slips through, and there will be a next one, Dr. Bellini, there is always a next one, kills someone whose blood will be partly on your hands, because you had the chance to stop it and chose loyalty to a man who has killed people instead. That's not fair. It's not supposed to be fair. It's supposed to be true." He softened fractionally, the exhaustion in his face suddenly visible in a way that made him look younger and more human than the badge had allowed. "I'm not asking you to destroy him out of spite, Katerina. I'm asking you to help me build a case airtight enough that when this finally comes apart, and it will come apart, these things always do, there's a version of justice that includes accountability without you having to watch federal agents drag him out in handcuffs in front of cameras while his organization burns the city down looking for whoever talked. You can be a careful witness instead of a casualty, but only if you start now." She thought of Walter Hines' widow, the tissue twisted into a wet rope. She thought of Lorenzo's hand tracing slow circles across her knuckles in a restaurant with no sign on the door, saying, "I think I am beginning to fall in love with you." She thought of a 6-year-old girl whose death had built both the empire and the man who tried, in his broken, brutal way, to atone for it ever since. "I need time," she said finally. "You have 6 days." The door closed. Katerina stood alone in her apartment, the rain still drumming against the windows, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that whatever came next, there was no version of her life that let her keep both the man she loved and the conscience that had made her fall for him in the first place. She was going to have to choose. And worse, far worse, she was going to have to find a way to make that choice without him ever knowing she'd been forced to make it at all. Her phone buzzed, a text from Lorenzo. "Dinner tomorrow? I have something I want to show you." She stared at the screen for a long time before she answered. "Yes," she typed finally. "I'll be there." It was, she would understand much later, the first lie she ever told him, and the beginning of every truth that came after. She wore the wire for the first time on a Tuesday, tucked beneath the collar of a blouse Lorenzo had given her himself, a small cruelty of circumstance that she tried very hard not to think about, as Marco's car wound through the city toward the penthouse. Webb's voice had been clinical in the briefing that morning. "You don't need to ask leading questions. You don't need to manufacture anything. Just let him talk the way he always does, and let the recorder do the rest." It had sounded simple in a windowless federal office. It felt like a slow, surgical betrayal now, riding up 61 floors in an elevator that smelled faintly of his cologne, toward a man who had no idea the woman he loved was carrying a microphone against her own skin. "You're quiet tonight," Lorenzo said when she arrived, studying her with the particular attentiveness that had once felt like the safest thing in her life, and now felt like the most dangerous. "Long shift?" "Something like that." She let him pour her a glass of wine she had no intention of finishing, let him lead her to the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city spread out beneath them in its glittering, indifferent grid. Let herself, for one terrible, treacherous moment, simply exist inside the fiction that this was still an ordinary night between two people who loved each other without complication. "I want to show you something," he said, and there was an uncharacteristic nervousness in it, a vulnerability she'd rarely seen from him. He led her to a locked drawer in his study, withdrew a small velvet box, and for one suspended, vertiginous second, Katerina's entire body went cold with the terrible, specific fear of a woman about to be proposed to by a man she was actively helping the FBI build a case against. It was not a ring. It was a key. "To this apartment," he said, "and to the one in Naples. The one that belonged to my grandmother before my father sold off everything that wasn't profitable." He pressed it into her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "I want you to have somewhere that's yours, Katerina, not borrowed, not arranged by Marco. Somewhere you can go whether I'm in the room or not. Because I have started to understand that the version of safety I've been offering you, locks I change without asking, drivers who appear like ghosts, is a safety built around my control of your life. And you deserve a version that's simply, unambiguously yours." The wire against her collarbone felt suddenly unbearably heavy. "Lorenzo." "I know what I am," he continued, before she could find words for the guilt closing her throat. "I know what loving me costs a person. The danger, the secrecy, the version of yourself you have to fold away every time we're together. I am not a good bet, Dottoressa. I have never once pretended to be. But I am telling you, as honestly as I know how to tell anyone anything, that I intend to spend whatever years I have left making the cost worth what it buys you." His thumb traced her cheek, achingly gentle for a man whose hands she now knew with documented certainty had taken lives. "I love you. Not the careful, performed version of love I learned to fake for cameras and senators, the real, terrifying, inconvenient kind that makes a man who has spent 15 years building walls start handing out keys instead." Katerina closed her hand around the key and felt the wire record every word, and understood with sudden, devastating clarity that she was going to have to choose, soon, between the truth she'd promised Marcus Webb and the truth standing in front of her with his heart laid open on a velvet box. "I love you too," she said, and it was the truest thing she'd said in this apartment in weeks, and it broke something in her to say it while a recorder fed every word to a federal agent 4 miles away. "I need you to know that, whatever happens. I need you to know that part was never a lie." Something in his face shifted, a flicker of unease, gone almost before she registered it, the instinct of a man who had survived this long by reading rooms for exactly the kind of subtext she was, despite every effort, leaking into her voice. "Why does that sound like a goodbye?" "It's not," she said quickly, too quickly. It's not a goodbye. He studied her for a long moment, and she watched him decide deliberately not to push, a mercy she didn't deserve and couldn't afford to examine too closely. Stay tonight, he said instead, voice rough. Not because of the key or the apartment or anything except that I would like, for one night, to simply have you here, without the city or my family or your dissertation pulling at either of us. She stayed. She lay awake long after his breathing evened into sleep beside her, the key cold in her closed fist, the wire she'd removed before bed sitting in her bag like an unexploded device, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only at 3 in the morning when every defence has worn thin, that whatever case Marcus Webb built from tonight's recording, it would not include the moment that mattered most. The one where Lorenzo Camorra, the most dangerous man in Chicago, had handed her a key to his grandmother's house in Naples like it was the only thing in the world he had left to give. That recording, at least, she resolved, would belong to no one but her. 3 weeks into feeding Webb carefully selected fragments, shipment dates, never names, warehouse locations, never the war room's exact address, Katerina discovered the thing that would unmake every careful boundary she'd tried to build between informant and lover. She found it by accident, in the way most devastating discoveries happen, not through investigation, but through an unguarded evening when Lorenzo, 3 glasses of wine past his usual control, fell asleep on the couch with his phone unlocked on the coffee table beside him. She wasn't looking. She told herself that for a long time afterward, in the particular self-protective way people tell themselves things they need to be true. She had simply reached for the remote, and the phone's screen had lit beneath her hand, and there, in a photo album labelled only with a single date, a date she recognised with a cold lurch as 15 years and 2 months before tonight, was a folder of images she had no right to see, and could not, once she'd seen them, ever unsee. A little girl. Dark curls, Lorenzo's exact eyes, a gap-toothed smile in a school photograph that had clearly been scanned and preserved with the obsessive care of a man protecting the only physical evidence left of someone he'd loved more than his own life. Sophia, age 5, blowing out candles. Sophia, age 6, asleep on Lorenzo's shoulder, on what was probably a plane, his arm wrapped around her with a tenderness that made Katerina's throat close. And then, the last image in the folder, dated 3 days before the death he'd told her about at dinner, Sophia in a hospital bed, small and pale, an IV taped to the back of one tiny hand, Lorenzo crouched beside her, with his forehead pressed to her temple, eyes closed, a man already grieving someone who hadn't yet died. Katerina set the phone down with shaking hands. She did not cry, not then. The tears came later, alone in her own apartment, when she finally let herself feel the full weight of what she'd seen. But something in her, looking at that photograph, reorganized itself permanently. Whatever Marcus Webb's case file said about Lorenzo Camorra, the body in the alley, the senator's irregular campaign finances, the 14 months of documented violence, none of it erased the truth in that hospital photograph. Both things were real, exactly as Webb had warned her. The wolf and the grieving father were the same man, occupying the same chest. And she had fallen in love with all of him. The parts she could defend, and the parts she couldn't. "You're awake," Lorenzo said groggily, stirring on the couch, his eyes finding hers with the soft confusion of a man surfacing from wine-heavy sleep. Then he saw her face, and something sharpened instantly in his expression. "What's wrong?" "I saw the photos," she admitted. "On your phone. I wasn't looking, I swear to you. The screen just lit up when I reached for the remote, and I saw Lorenzo. I saw Sophia. The hospital photo. 1980, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have looked." She expected anger. She'd seen, in the brief months she'd known him, exactly how cold his face could go when something breached the careful walls he kept around his grief. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. "I have never shown anyone that photograph," he said. "Not my father, not my closest associates. Marco doesn't know it exists." He reached for her hand, pulling her down onto the couch beside him, and for the first time since she'd known him, Lorenzo Camorra looked entirely, unguardedly young. Younger than his 39 years, younger than the empire he carried. A man briefly stripped back down to the 24-year-old who'd held his daughter's body in a hospital corridor and never fully recovered. I took it because I knew even then, even in the worst moment of my life, that I would need to remember exactly what I was losing in order to survive becoming whatever I needed to become afterward. You don't have to explain it to me. I want to. His thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand, an anchor for both of them. She loved the ocean. We took her to Positano the summer before she died, and she stood at the edge of the water for an hour, refusing to let anyone carry her in, because she wanted to walk into it herself, on her own terms, no matter how long it took her small legs to get there. A faint, devastated smile crossed his face. She was stubborn, fearless in a way that terrified her mother and delighted me. I used to tell her she'd grow up to run the legitimate side of the business better than I ever could, because she never let anyone tell her no without making them explain exactly why first. His voice cracked finally on the last word. She would have been 21 this spring. I think about who she might have become more than I think about almost anything else in my life. And I have never told another living person that until right now. Caterina pulled him into her arms, and Lorenzo Camorra, the most dangerous man in Chicago, a man with bodies and bribes and a private army at his command, wept silently against her shoulder for a daughter dead 15 years, his whole powerful frame shaking with a grief he had clearly never once allowed himself to fully feel in front of another person. "I love you," she whispered into his hair, and meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything, even as the wire she'd worn 3 weeks earlier sat coiled in a drawer 4 miles away, a betrayal she had not yet found the courage to undo. It should have been a quiet weekend. That was, Caterina would think later, the particular cruelty of how these things always seemed to happen. The world waited until you'd finally let your guard down, and then it took everything at once. She was 3 days off a brutal stretch of overnight shifts, finally catching up on sleep in her own apartment, when her phone began buzzing with a frequency that meant something had gone badly wrong. Text after text, from colleagues, from her attending, from a hospital PR liaison she'd spoken to exactly twice in 3 years of residency. She opened the first link with a feeling of dread that proved, within seconds, to be entirely justified. Chicago Tribune. Doctor's secret romance with reputed mob boss raises questions about hospital's $4.2 million donor. The photographs were grainy, but unmistakable. Caterina and Lorenzo outside the unmarked restaurant, his hand at the small of her back. The two of them on the 61st floor balcony, taken with a long lens from a building across the street she'd never thought to suspect. One, worst of all, of her getting into the unmarked black sedan outside the hospital parking garage, time-stamped, captioned with a question mark that did more damage than any accusation could have. Sources close to the Camorra organization, the article read, suggest Dr. Bellini may have provided privileged hospital pharmacy data that allowed Meridian Pharma to retroactively cover a counterfeit drug scandal before federal investigators could act. Northwestern Memorial has placed Dr. Bellini on administrative leave, pending an internal review. Caterina read it twice, 3 times, her hands gone numb around the phone. None of it was technically true. She had never given Lorenzo hospital data, had in fact done the opposite, feeding fragments of his operation to the FBI at enormous personal cost. But truth, she was learning with brutal speed, mattered far less than narrative once a story this combustible caught fire. The hospital's call came 40 minutes later. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, informed her she was suspended, effective immediately. Her residency placed under review by both the hospital's ethics board and, this part landed like a physical blow, a separate state medical board inquiry into possible licensing violations. "I never gave him anything," Caterina said, voice cracking. "Everything in that article is twisted. I've been working with the FBI, not against them." "I believe you," Okonkwo Reyes said, and there was real sympathy in it, which somehow made it worse. "But belief isn't evidence, Caterina, and right now the hospital's board sees $4 million in donor money, a federal investigation, and a resident photographed getting into a known crime boss's car. They need to be seen doing something." "I'm sorry. I wish I had better news." She called Webb next, fury and panic warring in her chest in roughly equal measure. "Did you leak this?" "No," he said, and his voice carried a tightness that told her something had gone wrong on his end too, something he hadn't yet decided how much to tell her. "But I have a guess who did. There's a rival organization, the Esposito family, out of the West Coast, that's been trying to muscle into Camorra territory for 2 years. If they got wind that you were feeding us intel, the smartest move available to them isn't to expose you to us. It's to expose you to him, publicly, in a way designed to look like you were always working against him from the start. Burn your credibility with both sides at once." The implication landed with sickening clarity. "You think Lorenzo's people will think I'm a federal informant?" "I think," Webb said carefully, "that whoever leaked this story wanted exactly that conclusion drawn by exactly the people who would react to it with violence instead of due process." A pause, heavier than the silence around it deserved. "Caterina, I need you to consider very seriously whether it's time to come in. We can offer protective custody while this settles. It's not ideal, but it's safer than wherever you are right now. I'm not going into hiding because of a tabloid article. It's not just a tabloid article anymore. It's a target painted on your back by an organization that has, by your own account, already killed a man for diverting a single pharmaceutical lot." Webb's voice dropped lower, urgent now. "I need you to lock your doors, stay where you are, and wait for someone from my office. I'm sending a unit to your apartment within the hour." She hung up before he finished the sentence, hands shaking, and called Lorenzo instead. The only call that actually mattered, the only conversation she could not survive not having before whatever came next. He answered on the first ring, voice already tight with a fury she'd never heard directed anywhere but at her enemies, and for one terrible second she thought it was directed at her. "I've seen it," he said before she could speak. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Katerina, because I do not have much time before this situation becomes far more dangerous than a newspaper article. I do not believe you gave them anything. I know you. I know what your face looks like when you're hiding something, and I have never once seen it directed at me. Until 3 weeks ago. And I chose then to trust the woman in front of me over the suspicion in my chest. And I do not regret that choice now." A door slammed somewhere on his end, footsteps, urgency. "But there are people in my organization who will not extend you that same trust, and within hours there will be a decision made about what to do with you that I may not be able to control. I need you to leave your apartment. Now. Marco is 3 minutes away." "Lorenzo, what's happening? What's happening?" he said, voice breaking with a rawness she'd only heard once before, weeping against her shoulder for a daughter dead 15 years, "is that I am about to find out exactly how much of my own family I am willing to defy to keep you alive. Get your coat. Marco is downstairs." The Camorra family, in its formal sense, the assembled capos, the consigliere, the men who had served Lorenzo's father before him and now reluctantly served the son, met that night in the basement of a restaurant in Little Italy that had been hosting exactly this kind of meeting for 4 generations. Caterina was not there for it, hidden instead in a safe house Marco had driven her to, with a speed that left no room for further argument. But Lorenzo told her about it later, in fragments, in the particular flat voice of a man recounting a battle he wasn't certain he'd won. His uncle Dominic, his father's brother, the family's consigliere since before Lorenzo was born, opened the meeting with the question that had clearly been simmering for weeks. "You've been photographed with a woman whose brother-in-law works organised crime task forces for the federal government, and within days of that photograph surfacing, 3 separate shipments are intercepted at the port with a precision that suggests someone fed the Bureau exact coordinates." Dominic's voice, Lorenzo said, had carried the particular calm that was always, in their family, more dangerous than shouting. "I want to know, nephew, whether you have lost your judgment, or whether you have simply decided your family's safety is worth less than your own happiness." "Caterina is not feeding anyone information," Lorenzo had said, and even repeating it to her later, his jaw had tightened with the memory of having to defend her to men who had known him his entire life. "I have watched her face under pressure that would break most trained operatives, and I am telling you, on my own life, that the woman I love is not your leak." "On your own life," Dominic repeated, "is precisely the wager you're making, Lorenzo, whether you intend it or not. We are not asking you to prove her innocence in a court of law. We are asking whether the risk she represents, proven informant or simply collateral exposure, is one this family can survive carrying." It was his cousin Tony, hot-tempered and ambitious in the particular way of men who had spent their whole lives slightly resentful of an inheritance that had skipped them, who finally said the thing the room had been circling. "We should eliminate the risk before it eliminates us. The woman disappears, the story dies, the federal pressure eases within a month." "This is not complicated, Lorenzo. This is exactly the kind of decision your father would have made in an hour, not agonized over for 3 weeks like a man with no spine left. Lorenzo told Caterina later that the moment Tony said, "The woman disappears," something in him had gone very still and very cold. Not the controlled stillness she'd seen in the warehouse, but something older, more dangerous, a thing he had inherited from his father's bloodline and spent 15 years trying to bury beneath pediatric wings and recall protocols. "If anyone in this room," he had said, voice flat enough that 3 men flexibly reached for chairs to steady themselves, "lays a hand on Caterina Bellini, I will not wait for a vote. I will not consult the consigliere. I will end that person myself, and I will do it in a way that ensures every family from here to Naples understands precisely what happens to men who threaten what belongs to me." He'd looked deliberately at his cousin. "Do you understand me, Tony?" The room had gone silent, in the particular way rooms go silent when a man who has spent his life being underestimated finally shows everyone exactly how much teeth he's been hiding. "This isn't a vote you get to win by threat alone," Dominic said finally, quieter now, the room's true power broker reasserting control. "I will give you 1 week, Lorenzo. 1 week to prove this woman is not the leak, to find the actual source of the surveillance photographs, and to bring this family verifiable proof that loving her does not cost us the operation your father and grandfather spent 4 decades building. If you cannot do that, if in 1 week the evidence still points to her, or worse, to active federal cooperation, the decision will be taken out of your hands entirely, and I promise you, nephew, it will not be gentle." When Lorenzo finished telling her this, sitting across from her in the small, anonymous safe-house kitchen at 2 in the morning, Caterina understood, with cold clarity, exactly how narrow the path in front of them had become. "There's something you need to know," she said, and her voice did not shake, though every instinct screamed at her to let it. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, and didn't, because I was a coward, and because some part of me genuinely believed I could protect both of us by keeping it secret." She met his eyes. "I wore a wire, Lorenzo, once. In your penthouse, the night you gave me the key. I've been feeding the FBI fragments, shipment dates, warehouse locations, for almost a month." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. "I never gave them the war room's location," she continued, words coming faster now, desperate to land every piece of context before he could shut his face down into whatever expression came next. "I never gave them names. I edited every single thing I told them to protect you, even while I was technically betraying you. And I know that doesn't make it forgivable. But I need you to understand that I never stopped loving you, not for a single second, even while I was lying to you about it." Lorenzo sat very still, his hands flat on the kitchen table, his face unreadable in a way that frightened her more than any explosion of anger could have. "You're not their leak," he said finally, very quietly. "You're worse. You're their witness. Which means, Caterina, that the 1 week my uncle gave me to prove your innocence has just become the most dangerous deadline either of us has ever faced. Because the moment my family discovers what you just told me, no version of love I have for you will be enough to save your life." The discovery, when it came, did not come from Lorenzo's family at all. It came from inside his own organization, from the one place he had never thought to look. Marco found him 3 days later in the war room, face ashen, a tablet clutched in his hand like something that might detonate. "Boss, you need to see this." It was a video file. Security footage from a server room in the River North building, time-stamped 11 days earlier, showing a man Lorenzo had trusted for 6 years, his head of internal security, Vittorio Marchetti, copying files from a restricted server onto an external drive at 2 in the morning. "Vittorio," Lorenzo said, the name coming out of him like something physically painful. He's had access to everything. The war room's location, the shipment manifests, Katarina's file. "There's more," Marco said grimly, pulling up a second window. Encrypted message logs, recovered through a back door one of Elena's analysts had built into the organization's own internal communications years ago. Ostensibly for security audits, never intended for exactly this kind of discovery. The messages were between Vittorio and an unlisted number that, when traced, led to a known fixer for the Esposito family. "She's the leverage," one message read. "Camora's gone soft over a doctor. If we expose the relationship publicly, his own family does our work for us. If that doesn't break him, we take her directly. Either way, the operation collapses from the inside." Lorenzo read it twice, 3 times, something cold and absolute settling over his features that Marco had only seen once before, 15 years ago, in a hospital corridor in Naples. "He's the leak," Lorenzo said. "Not Caterina. Vittorio sold us to Esposito for, what, money? Position?" He looked up. "Where is he now?" "That's the problem, boss." Marco's jaw tightened. "He's not at the office. We pulled his phone location an hour ago. It pinged near the safe house." The blood left Lorenzo's face entirely. Caterina's safe house. He was already moving before Marco finished the sentence, taking the war room stairs 2 at a time, barking orders into a phone that connected him to 3 separate cars of men he trusted with his actual life, rather than merely his business. Every instinct he'd spent 15 years honing, screaming the same single fact. "I am too far away, and I might already be too late." At the safe house, Caterina had spent the morning doing the only thing that had ever made fear bearable for her, working, methodically, through the files Webb had left with her, cross-referencing supply chain data, looking for any thread that might prove what she now knew to be true, that someone inside Lorenzo's own organization was the actual source of the leak. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear the back door's lock disengage, didn't hear footsteps until they were already in the kitchen doorway behind her. "Dr. Bellini." Vittorio Marchetti's voice was pleasant, almost gentle, which made it infinitely worse. "I'm sorry it's come to this, truly. You seem like a decent woman caught in a very bad family." Caterina's hand found the kitchen knife on the counter before her mind had fully processed the danger. Every instinct from a decade of emergency medicine. Assess the threat, locate the exit, buy time, firing in rapid, cold sequence. "Vittorio, I know you're Lorenzo's head of security. Whatever's happening, you don't want to—" "I want quite a lot of things, actually," he said, stepping fully into the kitchen, a gun held with the casual competence of a man who had used one before and would not hesitate to again. "I want the Esposito family's protection when this organization finally collapses, which it will, the moment word gets out that Lorenzo Camorra fell in love with an FBI informant. I want the considerable payment already wired to an account you'll never trace. And I want you, Dottoressa, to come with me quietly, Because a hostage with real leverage is worth far more to my new employers than a body, and I would genuinely prefer not to make this messier than it needs to be. Lorenzo will kill you for this. Lorenzo, Vittorio said almost sadly, has spent 15 years building an empire on top of a dead daughter and calling it redemption. He will not survive what's coming, Dr. Bellini, with or without my help. The only question that matters right now is whether you survive it with him. He gestured with the gun toward the door. Come quietly, and I promise you a far better outcome than the one waiting for you if I have to make this difficult. Caterina's mind raced through every option with the cold, fast calculus she'd learned running codes in trauma bays. Comply and buy time, resist and risk immediate violence, stall and hope Lorenzo's people found the location before Vittorio got her into a car. She chose the only option that gave her any control at all. Okay, she said, raising her hands slowly, setting the knife down with deliberate, visible care. Okay, I'll come. It was, she understood even as she said it, both a surrender and the opening move of the only fight she had left to give. Lorenzo arrived at the safe house 11 minutes too late to stop the abduction, and exactly in time to find the single clue Caterina had left him on purpose, the kitchen knife, not put away, not hidden, but laid deliberately across the counter, pointing toward the back door. The only message she'd had time to leave, a man trained to read rooms for exactly this kind of silent signal. She left it for me, Lorenzo said, kneeling by the counter, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made even Marco take an instinctive step back. She knew I'd understand. Direction of travel. She's telling me which way they went. He stood, already moving, already barking coordinates into his phone, every trace of the careful, philanthropic businessman entirely gone, replaced by something Marco had heard about from older men in the organization, but had genuinely never witnessed himself. The version of Lorenzo Camorra his father had been, before 15 years of grief had rebuilt him into someone gentler. Boss, Marco said carefully, jogging to keep pace. We should call this in. Federal backup, local police presence on the route? No police, Lorenzo said flatly. No federal anything. The moment law enforcement is involved, Vittorio panics, and a panicked man with a hostage and an Esposito payday waiting at the end of this does not make rational decisions. This ends with my hands, Marco, or it doesn't end at all. It took 4 hours of brutal, methodical tracking, traffic camera footage Elena pulled through a backdoor system, a gas station purchase on a card Vittorio had stupidly forgotten was still linked to organization funds, a toll booth camera that placed a black SUV heading toward an industrial property on the city's southwest side that, Lorenzo realized with a cold lurch of recognition, his own family had used for exactly this purpose 2 decades earlier, before he'd taken over and quietly shut down every facility his father had once used for things he refused to let himself think too hard about. He went in alone. He would tell Caterina later that this was the one decision in the entire ordeal he would never apologize for, regardless of what it cost him, because the moment Marco's men surrounded the building, Vittorio's first instinct would be to use his hostage as a shield, and Lorenzo was not willing to gamble Caterina's life on anyone's aim but his own. He found them in a stripped office on the building's 2nd floor, Caterina bound to a chair, a livid bruise blooming along her jaw, where Vittorio had apparently struck her for some defiance Lorenzo would later learn had involved her telling the man, with remarkable composure for a hostage, that his entire plan was strategically incoherent and would get him killed within the week. "Lorenzo!" Vittorio's voice carried genuine surprise. He had clearly expected an army, not one man, unarmed at his sides, walking through the door with the deliberate, unhurried calm of someone who had already decided exactly how this ended. "You came alone." "That's either very brave or very stupid." "I've been told that before," Lorenzo said, eyes never leaving Caterina's, reading in one glance the controlled fear behind her steady gaze, cataloguing the bruise, the bound wrists, the small, defiant set of her jaw that told him, even now, even here, she had not stopped fighting. "Let her go, Vittorio. This is between you and me. It was always going to be between you and me. The moment you decided to betray 6 years of trust for an Esposito paycheck. You think this is about money?" Something genuinely wounded flickered across Vittorio's face. "I watched you become unrecognizable, Lorenzo. The man who used to understand that this family survives through strength, through fear, through being the thing other organizations are afraid to cross. And you turned us into a charity. Pediatric wings. War rooms tracing supply chains like we're a legitimate corporation instead of what we actually are. I did not betray this family. I tried to save it from a boss who fell in love with a doctor and forgot what blood we actually come from." "Then you should have come to me directly," Lorenzo said, voice dropping low, dangerous. "Instead, you sold us to a rival family, leaked photographs that destroyed a good woman's career, and put a gun on someone who has never once threatened you." He took a slow step forward, and Vittorio's gun arm tightened, swinging between Lorenzo and Caterina with the jerky uncertainty of a man whose careful plan had not accounted for facing his boss alone. "For 15 years, I have not taken up a weapon myself. I have built an organization of people I trusted to handle violence so that I would not have to become my father, so that some part of me could still look at my daughter's photograph and believe I had honored what she would have wanted me to become." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "You have made certain today that those 15 years are about to end." What happened next took less than 4 seconds, though Caterina would replay every fraction of it for months afterward. Vittorio's gun swinging toward Lorenzo in a final desperate move, Lorenzo closing the distance between them with a speed that should have been impossible for a man who'd spent 15 years in boardrooms rather than alleys. The brief, brutal struggle that ended with Vittorio on the ground and Lorenzo standing over him, breathing hard. A gun that had been Vittorio's own, now steady in his hand. He did not fire it. Caterina would understand later that this restraint, choosing in the end to call Marco's men in to take Vittorio alive rather than ending it himself in that room, was the single most important decision Lorenzo Camorra made in the entire ordeal, the moment that separated the man trying to become something better from the inheritance he'd spent his whole life resisting. He crossed the room instead, cutting her bindings with hands that shook for the first time since she'd known him, and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it nearly hurt, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and relief, and a fear he had clearly never let himself fully feel until exactly this moment. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair, voice breaking completely. "For the first time in 15 years, Caterina, I took up arms for someone, not for power, not for my family's business, not for revenge. For you. Only for you. And I have never, in my entire life, been more terrified of anything than I was of losing this fight. The weeks that followed unspooled in a blur of consequences neither of them had fully anticipated. Vittorio Marchetti, delivered to Marco's people rather than the police, disappeared from Caterina's life entirely. She did not ask what happened to him, and Lorenzo did not offer, and the silence between them on that particular subject became one of the unspoken boundaries that defined the strange, fragile new shape of their relationship. The Esposito family's involvement, once exposed through the encrypted messages Elena had recovered, triggered a quiet, brutal realignment of territory across the Midwest that played out in headlines Caterina deliberately avoided reading, understanding instinctively that whatever justice existed in Lorenzo's world operated by rules she did not want to fully witness, even as she continued, somehow, to love the man at the center of them. Dominic, the consigliere, called a second family meeting 10 days after the rescue. This one, Lorenzo told her afterward, had gone very differently from the first. "You were right to defy us," Dominic had said, with the particular grudging respect of a man who valued strength above all else, and had just watched his nephew demonstrate an enormous, undeniable quantity of it. The leak was internal. The woman was loyal, and more than that, she showed courage in that room that men twice her size would not have managed. "I withdraw my concern, Lorenzo. But I will tell you plainly, the federal pressure has not eased. If anything, the Esposito collapse has drawn more attention to our operations, not less. You need to consider, very seriously, what kind of future this family has left, and what kind of future you intend to build inside it, with or without her." It was a warning dressed as a blessing, and Lorenzo understood it exactly as intended. For Caterina, the professional consequences proved harder to undo than the family's suspicion had been. The hospital's ethics board, after a 6-week review that felt to her like a slow public execution, ultimately cleared her of any wrongdoing. Webb's testimony about her cooperation with federal investigators, delivered under careful legal constraints that protected the integrity of the ongoing case, had been the decisive factor. But the damage to her reputation within the medical community proved far more durable than any official ruling. Patients she'd treated for years looked at her differently. Colleagues who'd once sought her out for second opinions now found reasons to avoid eye contact in hallways. Her attending, Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, fought for her reinstatement with a loyalty that moved her to tears, but even he could not fully undo the tabloid narrative that had calcified in the public mind. The doctor who fell in love with a mob boss. "I don't regret any of it," she told Lorenzo one night, sitting on the floor of his penthouse with her back against the couch, exhausted from a reinstatement hearing that had felt more like an interrogation than a professional review. "Not the warehouse, not the wire, not loving you. But I won't pretend it hasn't cost me things I'm not sure I'll ever get back." "I know," Lorenzo said quietly, sitting beside her, his hand finding hers in the particular way that had become, over these difficult months, the only language either of them fully trusted anymore. "I have spent the last 6 weeks trying to find a version of my life that doesn't keep costing you everything you've built. I am not certain, Caterina, that such a version exists while I remain who I currently am." She turned to look at him, hearing something underneath the words that frightened her more than Vittorio's gun had. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that I have spent 15 years convincing myself that I could build something honorable inside an organization built on dishonor. That a war room tracing counterfeit drugs could somehow balance the scale against everything my family has done, is doing, will continue to do long after I'm gone. And I watched you 3 weeks ago, sitting bound to a chair with a bruise on your face, refusing to stop being yourself, even with a gun pointed at you. And I understood something I have been avoiding understanding for 15 years. His voice dropped, rougher now, raw with a vulnerability she'd rarely seen even from him. I cannot protect you inside this life, Katerina. Not fully, not the way you deserve. Every day you stay with me is a day you remain a target for every rival, every federal investigation, every internal betrayal my family's business will inevitably produce. I love you too much to keep pretending that isn't true. Are you breaking up with me? No. His hand tightened around hers, fierce, immediate. I am telling you that I am beginning to consider something I have never once let myself consider in 15 years of running this organization. Walking away from it entirely. Not the legitimate pharmaceutical work, not the war room, not the foundation, but the rest of it. The blood, the territory wars, the version of my family's business that requires me to remain permanently a target, as dangerous to love as I am necessary to fear. He looked at her, eyes dark and steady. I do not know yet what that would cost either of us, but I know I am no longer willing to keep choosing an empire over the only person who has ever made me want to put it down. It was, of course, never going to be as simple as wanting to walk away. Dominic made that brutally clear within a week of Lorenzo first floating the idea, in a private conversation conducted not in the basement restaurant this time, but in Lorenzo's own war room, as if the consigliere wanted the location itself to underscore the stakes of what was being discussed. You think you can simply resign, Dominic said, voice flat with a contempt Lorenzo had rarely heard directed at him before. The way a man leaves a corporate job he's grown tired of. You are not an employee, Lorenzo. You are the fourth generation of a bloodline that has run this organization for 90 years. There is no clean exit. There is no severance package. The only ways out of this family are death, federal prison, or witness protection after testifying against everyone who trusted you. And I promise you, nephew, the last option will not feel like freedom. It will feel like spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder for the family you betrayed. I'm not interested in betraying anyone, Lorenzo said. I want to negotiate a transition. The legitimate pharmaceutical operations remain, fully, transparently legal, with proper oversight, generating more sustainable revenue than half our current territory disputes combined. The rest, the parts that require violence and federal exposure, I want to dissolve gradually, transferred to whatever family is willing to absorb the territory in exchange for guaranteed non-interference in the legitimate business going forward. Dominic's laugh held no warmth at all. You want to hand our territory to the Espositos, the same family that just tried to kidnap your girlfriend, and trust them to leave us alone out of professional courtesy? Not the Espositos. The Marinellis in Cicero. They've wanted expanded territory for a decade and have always respected the boundaries of operations they don't directly control. Lorenzo's voice carried the careful precision of a man who had clearly spent weeks wargaming exactly this conversation. It's not betrayal, Uncle. It's succession planning, the way every legitimate business eventually transitions when its leadership decides a different path serves the organization's long-term survival better than the status quo. And if I refuse to support this transition, then I will do it without your support, Lorenzo said quietly, and I will hope, for the sake of the relationship we've shared my entire life, that you choose not to stand in the way of the first decision I have ever made entirely for myself, rather than for this family's expectations. The negotiation that followed consumed the better part of 2 months. Careful, dangerous conversations conducted through trusted intermediaries with the Marinelli organization, a gradual, deliberate withdrawal from territory disputes that had to look, to outside observers and rival families alike, like organic, strategic repositioning rather than the controlled collapse of a 90-year dynasty. Katerina watched it unfold from a careful distance, understanding instinctively that her direct involvement in these negotiations would only complicate an already volatile process. But she felt the toll it took on Lorenzo every night he came home, increasingly rare nights as the work consumed him, looking older, more exhausted, carrying the particular weight of a man dismantling the only inheritance he'd ever been given. "Do you regret it?" she asked him one night, 3 weeks into the transition, finding him in his study, staring at documents he hadn't moved in over an hour. "Starting this, choosing me over the family business." "Never," he said, without hesitation, looking up to find her in the doorway. "But I won't pretend it isn't harder than I expected. 15 years of identity doesn't simply unwind because you've decided it should." He set down the documents, rubbing his eyes with the exhausted gesture of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Dominic has stopped speaking to me, except when business requires it. Tony has been making comments to the other capos that I'm certain are meant to reach my ears, questioning my judgment, my loyalty, whether a man this distracted by a woman is fit to lead the family through a transition this delicate." His jaw tightened. "I am gambling everything, Katerina. The family's stability, my own safety, possibly yours. And some days I am not entirely certain the gamble is the right one." "It is," she said, crossing the room to sit beside him, taking his hand the way he so often took hers. An anchor, offered freely, asking nothing in return, except the simple fact of being trusted with it. "I know it doesn't feel that way some days, but Lorenzo, the man building this transition, the man choosing his own conscience over 90 years of inherited expectation, that's the man Sophia would have wanted you to become. Not the boss who inherited an empire. The father who finally found a way to honor her by refusing to let any more children die for someone else's profit margin." He turned to look at her, something fragile and grateful moving across his face. "I have never told you this," he said quietly, "but you are the only person in 15 years who has ever spoken about her without flinching, without treating her like a wound I need to be protected from discussing. You speak about my daughter like she was a real person, with a real future that was stolen, instead of a tragedy I should learn to move past." "She was a real person," Katerina said softly, "and she still matters, Lorenzo. Walking away from this family's violence doesn't dishonor what you built in her name. It completes it." It was, neither of them yet knew, the calm before the storm that would finally force their hand. Because 3 days later, word reached Tony Camorra, through channels no one had anticipated, that his cousin's transition plan included a detail Lorenzo had kept carefully hidden even from Dominic. A private understanding with Marcus Webb's task force that when the time was right, Lorenzo intended to provide testimony sufficient to dismantle not just his own operations, but the entire interconnected network of organized crime families across 3 states. Tony Camorra did not wait for permission before he acted. He convened his own meeting, illegal under the family's traditional structure, But Tony had never been a man overly concerned with tradition when ambition offered a faster path. Gathering 4 capos loyal to him in the basement of a different restaurant, one his cousin had no surveillance access to, and laid out the discovery with the particular relish of a man who had finally found the leverage he'd been hunting for months. "He's not retiring," Tony told the room. "He's flipping. Webb's task force has been building a case against this family for over a year, and my cousin, the boss who's supposed to protect us, has apparently decided his own survival and his girlfriend's freedom are worth more than 90 years of family loyalty." He let the accusation settle, watching it land on faces that had served the Camorra name since before Tony was born. "I have proof. Encrypted communications between Lorenzo's people and Webb's office, dated 3 weeks ago, discussing terms for testimony in exchange for reduced charges and witness protection. It was, Tony would never admit, a partial fabrication. The communications were real, intercepted through a contact inside the federal building's IT department, but the terms had not yet been finalized, the testimony not yet committed to. Tony understood, with the cold pragmatism of a man who had waited his entire life for exactly this opportunity, that the difference between considering testimony and committed traitor mattered far less than how convincingly he could present the accusation to men who had spent their whole lives being taught that betrayal was the only unforgivable sin. "The family's law is clear," Tony continued, voice hardening. "A boss who turns informant doesn't get a grace period for good behavior. He gets the same sentence anyone else would receive for selling out 90 years of blood. And the woman who turned him soft enough to consider it dies with him, so there's no witness left to testify, no leverage left for the federal government to use." The vote that followed was not unanimous. 2 of the 4 capos hesitated, uncertain about moving against a sitting boss without Dominic's explicit approval. But Tony had counted votes before convening the meeting and knew, with the precision of a man who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment, that 3 votes were enough to authorize what came next. Dominic learned of the order 4 hours later, far too late to stop its initial momentum, and immediately understood the catastrophic position it placed him in. Caught between loyalty to a nephew he had personally trained, doubt about whether that nephew's transition plan truly included betrayal, and the brutal political reality that openly opposing Tony's faction now, with the order already issued, risked tearing the entire organization apart in a civil war that would leave both Camorra cousins dead and the family's territory carved up by rivals within a month. He chose the only option that preserved any possibility of a future. He called Lorenzo directly, voice carrying none of its usual cold authority, stripped down to something almost paternal in its urgency. "Tony has issued a kill order," Dominic said without preamble the moment Lorenzo answered. "On you and on Katerina. He claims he has proof you're cooperating with the federal task force, proof I have not personally verified, and proof I do not fully trust, but proof that has already convinced enough of the family's capos to authorize action. You have hours, Lorenzo, not days. Whatever you intend to do, you need to do it now." Lorenzo's blood went cold. Whose hand is carrying it out? Tony's, personally, with 2 men loyal to him. They left 20 minutes ago. I don't know their exact destination, but given the timing, I would assume they're heading for your apartment first, and Katerina's hospital second. She's not at the hospital. She's reinstated, but on a modified schedule. Lorenzo was already moving, grabbing his coat, his phone pressed to his ear with one hand, while the other reached for a gun he kept locked in his study, a weapon he had not touched in 15 years, and now found himself reaching for with grim, practiced certainty. "Dominic, why are you telling me this? You could let this happen. It solves your problem with me as cleanly as anything could." A long silence on the line. "Because, despite everything," Dominic said finally, voice rough, with an emotion Lorenzo had genuinely never heard from his uncle before, "you are still my brother's son, and I watched you become someone better than any of us thought you'd become, even if it cost this family something we weren't prepared to lose. I cannot stop Tony's order, but I am not willing to let it succeed without at least giving you the chance to run." "Run where? This is Tony's territory as much as it's mine. Every safe house, every contact, every road out of this city." "Not every road," Dominic interrupted. "There's a private airstrip 40 miles southwest, registered to a shell company that has never once appeared in any operational document Tony has access to. I used it myself, years ago, for things your father never knew about. The plane is fueled and ready within the hour if you call the number I'm about to send you." A pause, heavy with everything neither man could quite say. "Get her, Lorenzo. Get out. And do not, under any circumstances, look back to settle this with Tony directly. That is exactly the confrontation he is hoping you'll choose, because it gives him the justification he needs to finish what tonight's order started." Lorenzo was already in the car, Marco driving with white-knuckled urgency through streets that suddenly felt like enemy territory, in a city he'd spent his entire life believing belonged to him. "Katerina," he said into the phone, the moment her line connected, voice raw with a fear that cut through every careful control he'd built over 15 years. "Listen to me very carefully. I need you to leave wherever you are right now and meet me at the corner of Halstead and Roosevelt in exactly 12 minutes. Don't ask why. Don't pack anything. Just go, now, and trust me the way you trusted me in that warehouse 15 months ago, when you looked a dangerous man directly in the eye and decided to believe him anyway." She was waiting at the corner when Marco's car pulled up. Exactly 12 minutes later, no questions asked, every instinct from a decade of medical training telling her that some emergencies didn't allow time for explanation before action. "Get in," Lorenzo said, already reaching to pull the door shut behind her before the car had fully stopped moving, Marco accelerating away from the curb with a precision that suggested he'd planned this exact escape route days, not minutes, in advance. "Tony's issued a kill order on both of us. We have a plane waiting 40 miles from here, and after that, I genuinely do not know." Katerina's hands found his without hesitation, steadier than either of them expected. "Tell me what you need from me." "I need you to understand," Lorenzo said, voice tight with the particular controlled urgency of a man holding back panic through sheer force of will, "that the moment we get on that plane, we are choosing a life neither of us has ever lived. No hospital, no residency, no penthouse, no foundation, no name either of us currently carries. 48 hours from now, if we are very, very lucky, we are alive somewhere Tony cannot reach us, and we begin building an entirely different existence from absolutely nothing." His grip on her hand tightened. "I need to know, Katerina, before we get on that plane, whether you are willing to choose that life, because I will not force this on you. If you want out, If you want Webb's protective custody instead, the federal program, instead of running with a man your own government is actively investigating, I will make Marco take you there right now, and I will face whatever comes next alone, because I would rather lose you to safety than keep you and lose you to violence instead. I already chose, Katerina said, voice fierce despite the tears she could feel building behind her eyes. I chose in a warehouse 15 months ago. I chose every single day since, even when it cost me my career, even when I was terrified of what loving you actually meant. I am not choosing differently now because the stakes finally caught up to the choice I already made. She pulled his hand to her chest, holding it against her racing heart. Wherever we're going, Lorenzo, I'm going with you. That's not negotiable. The 48 hours that followed unfolded like a fever dream neither of them would ever fully describe to anyone, even years later, even once the danger had long passed. The private airstrip Dominic had described proved real. The plane fueled and waiting exactly as promised, piloted by a man who asked no questions and clearly had been paid years earlier for exactly this kind of discretion. They flew first to a small regional airport in Michigan, then transferred, under names neither of them recognized as their own, to a second flight that took them, finally, exhausted and shaking with adrenaline that had nowhere left to go, to a private location Lorenzo would only describe as somewhere Tony has never once had reason to look. It was there, in a cramped, anonymous safe house, owned by a contact so far removed from the Camorra organization that even Dominic didn't know about it, that Lorenzo finally called Marcus Webb directly. The call neither of them had ever expected him to make voluntarily. Delivered now not as an informant cooperating under duress, but as a man with no other path left to survival. "I want to testify," Lorenzo said, the moment Webb answered, his voice carrying none of its usual control, stripped down to raw, exhausted honesty. Full cooperation. Every operation, every name, every shipment route I have knowledge of, going back 15 years. I want witness protection for myself and for Katerina, and I want it processed faster than your bureaucracy typically allows, because there is currently a kill order on both our lives, and we have at most another day before Tony's people find the trail we left getting here. There was a long silence on the line. Webb, Katerina would learn later, had spent 14 months building toward exactly this outcome, and still found himself genuinely stunned to be receiving it through a phone call rather than years of additional pressure. "You understand what full cooperation means," Webb said finally, voice careful. "Not just Meridian Pharma, not just the counterfeit pharmaceutical operation. Everything, Lorenzo. Every family connected to yours, every operation you have direct knowledge of, testimony that will be used to dismantle organized crime networks across 3 states and put away men you have known your entire life." "I understand exactly what it means," Lorenzo said. "I have spent 15 years building something inside an inheritance I never asked for, trying to convince myself that quiet redemption was enough to balance the scale. I was wrong. The only way to actually balance it, the only way to actually become the man I want Katerina to spend the rest of her life with, the man my daughter would have wanted me to become, is to finish what I started, all the way through, regardless of what it costs me." His voice broke just slightly on the last words. I am asking for protection for the woman I love, Agent Webb, and I am offering you everything I have in exchange for it. That is not a negotiation. It is the only choice I have left that I can live with. I can have a protective detail to your location within 6 hours, Webb said. But Lorenzo, once this starts, there's no walking it back. Once you're in the system, once your testimony is on record, you cannot decide 3 weeks from now that you've changed your mind. Are you certain? Lorenzo looked across the small, anonymous room at Katerina, exhausted and frightened and utterly, unwaveringly present beside him through every terrifying hour of the last 2 days, and felt, for the first time in 15 years, something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to recognize as its distant cousin. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, he said. The federal protective custody process moved with a speed that surprised even Webb, who had spent 14 months watching this exact case crawl through every conceivable bureaucratic delay. Katerina and Lorenzo spent the first 3 weeks in a secure federal facility outside the city, separated for portions of each day for individual debriefing. Lorenzo's sessions stretching 12 hours at a time as he laid out, with the same meticulous precision he'd once used to trace counterfeit pharmaceutical shipments, the entire architecture of an organization 4 generations deep. Names, dates, bank accounts routed through 3 countries. The full scope of operations Vittorio had betrayed, the operations Tony's faction controlled, the careful network of legitimate businesses that had laundered money for the family since before Lorenzo's grandfather first arrived in Chicago from Naples with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do whatever the new world required. You don't have to watch any of it, Webb told Katerina gently, during one of the rare hours they were permitted together, finding her in the facility's small common room, staring at a muted television, where a news segment about a series of coordinated federal raids played silently across the screen. The arrests are happening as we speak, but you're not required to follow the coverage if it's too much. I want to know, Katerina said quietly. I owe it to Walter Hines's widow at minimum to understand exactly what this cost and what it bought. What it bought over the following months proved to be substantial. 41 arrests across 3 states, including Tony Camorra himself, taken into custody at a property he'd believed secure precisely because Lorenzo's testimony had identified it as one of the few locations even Dominic hadn't known about. Dominic himself was charged, but, through a careful plea arrangement his own decades of caution had clearly anticipated, received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for corroborating testimony that filled gaps even Lorenzo's account couldn't reach. The Esposito family's West Coast operations collapsed within weeks, destabilized by the same federal pressure that had originally driven Vittorio's betrayal, an irony Lorenzo noted with a grim, exhausted satisfaction during one of his final debriefing sessions. The legitimate pharmaceutical operations Lorenzo had spent 15 years building survived, transitioned through careful legal arrangements into an independent foundation that continued funding the pediatric cardiac unit at Northwestern Memorial under new, transparent leadership with no connection to either Lorenzo or the Camorra name. A final act of penance, Katerina understood, for a man determined to make certain that whatever good he'd built outlasted the empire it had grown from. The trial itself, when it finally came, unfolded over 6 grueling weeks that Katerina watched in careful, anonymized snippets through Webb's office, never permitted to attend in person for security reasons that no longer required explanation. She watched, through second-hand accounts and the occasional photograph Webb shared against strict protocol, as Lorenzo Camorra sat in a federal courtroom and testified in methodical, devastating detail against the only family he had ever known. He did not flinch from any of it, Webb told her afterward. He answered every question with the same precise honesty he'd shown in their very first debriefing session, including the questions that clearly cost him the most, questions about his own violence, his own complicity in 15 years of an organization's brutality, delivered without the careful distance of a man trying to minimize his own guilt. "I am not here today because I believe I have earned forgiveness," Lorenzo told the courtroom, in testimony that would later be quoted in 3 separate news outlets. "I am here because I spent 15 years telling myself that controlling violence from the inside was different from committing it. And I have come to understand that the distinction was a comfortable lie I told myself to survive what I had become. I cannot undo what this organization has done, what I personally have done. I can only offer this testimony, in full, in the hope that it prevents even a fraction of the harm I spent 15 years failing to fully prevent myself." Tony Camorra, convicted on racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder charges related to the kill order, received a sentence of 32 years. Vittorio Marchetti, located eventually through a federal task force operating in coordination with Lorenzo's testimony, received 22 years for his role in the Esposito conspiracy. Dominic, his cooperation weighed carefully against decades of leadership within the organization, received 8 years, eligible for parole in 5. Lorenzo himself, under the terms of his cooperation agreement, received a significantly reduced sentence, 18 months, the majority of which the court agreed to convert into supervised service requirements, given the scope and value of his testimony, followed by entry into the Federal Witness Protection Program alongside Katerina, whose own cooperation, beginning with 3 months of carefully edited intelligence fed through Marcus Webb's careful guidance, was formally acknowledged as instrumental to the case's success. 18 months, Katerina said, the night the sentencing was finalized, sitting across from Lorenzo in the small federal housing unit they'd been assigned during the final stage of the process, both of them still adjusting to the strange, suspended reality of a life paused between one identity and the next. "I can survive 18 months. I've survived worse." "I know you can," Lorenzo said, reaching for her hand across the small table, the gesture as natural now as breathing, 15 months and a lifetime of danger having worn away every hesitation either of them once carried. "But Katerina, I need you to understand something before this next chapter begins. Whatever name they give us when this is finished, whatever city, whatever life we're permitted to rebuild, I am not the same man who stood in a warehouse and told you I hadn't decided whether you were the bravest woman I'd ever met or the stupidest." His thumb traced slow circles across her knuckles, the same gesture that had undone her completely on their second real conversation, 15 months and an entire transformed life ago. "I am simply a man who loves you, with nothing left to offer except the truth and the hope that it's finally, after everything, enough." The Federal Witness Protection Program, Katerina learned, was a far stranger and more bureaucratically mundane process than any of the espionage films had prepared her for. A series of careful interviews about preferences, skill transferability, regional safety assessments, and finally, after months of careful planning, a single meeting with a placement coordinator who slid 2 folders across a plain conference table with the unceremonious efficiency of a woman who had done this hundreds of times before. Rome, the coordinator said, was Mr. Kimura's request, given his family's historical roots in Italy and his fluency. We've coordinated with Italian authorities for a parallel protection arrangement. Unusual, but his testimony's value to ongoing international investigations made the cross-border cooperation worth the additional complexity. You'll have new identities, fully documented, fully integrated into Italian systems. New names, new histories, consistent enough to withstand scrutiny, but flexible enough to let you build whatever life you actually want underneath them. Katerina opened her folder with hands that, after everything, the warehouse, the wire, the kidnapping, the kill order, 18 months of a life lived in careful, monitored fragments, still managed to shake with something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely close to hope. Caterina Conti, physician. Relocating from the United States following the completion of an international medical fellowship, she would, the documentation explained, be eligible to sit for Italian medical licensing exams within 6 months. Her residency credentials transferable through a careful bureaucratic process the placement coordinator assured her had already been quietly initiated. A new hospital, a new specialty track if she wanted one, pediatric cardiology perhaps, a direction she'd been quietly considering since the night Lorenzo first told her about Sophia, though she hadn't yet said this out loud to anyone, including herself. Lorenzo's folder, beside hers, read, Lorenzo Conti, independent pharmaceutical consultant, a name that preserved, in its quiet way, the family she'd carried with her, attached now to a man building an entirely different kind of legacy. You don't have to take the same surname, the coordinator said, noting Katerina's expression as she compared the 2 folders. It's common practice for protected witnesses entering relationships to share a surname for documentation consistency, but it's entirely optional. We can adjust either identity if you'd prefer separate names. Katerina looked across the table at Lorenzo, who was watching her with the particular careful stillness he still carried into any moment that mattered. The same stillness she'd first encountered in a dark warehouse 15 months ago, before she'd understood it was not coldness, but a man permanently braced for loss, learning slowly, painfully, that some things were finally safe enough to want without flinching. Conti, she said, I'll keep it, both of us. Something moved across Lorenzo's face that she'd only seen a handful of times in their entire relationship. The rare, unguarded vulnerability of a man who had spent 15 years convinced he didn't deserve the things he wanted most. You don't have to, he said quietly, once the coordinator had stepped out to retrieve additional paperwork, leaving them alone in the small conference room. I would understand, Katerina, if you wanted a name that belonged entirely to you. A fresh start that isn't tied to mine, even in this small way. I don't want a fresh start that isn't tied to yours, she said simply. I want a fresh start with you in it. That's the entire point, Lorenzo. I didn't fall in love with a name. I fell in love with a man who handed me a key to his grandmother's apartment in Naples before either of us understood we'd actually need it. She reached across the table, taking his hand the way she had 100 times before, in penthouses and safe houses and federal conference rooms, the gesture itself the truest constant either of them had carried through everything. Rome isn't far from Naples. We could visit, see the apartment, maybe even keep it if the protection program allows it. It allows it, Lorenzo said, voice rough with something that was not quite tears, but lived in the same neighborhood. I made certain of that during the placement negotiations, though I didn't want to mention it until I knew you'd actually choose Rome with me. A faint, exhausted smile broke across his face. I believe Sophia would have loved you, Katerina. I think about that more than almost anything else, watching you choose this, choose me, choose everything this life still costs both of us, even now, even after everything. She would have loved the woman fierce enough to look a dangerous man in the eye and tell him the truth, and never once stop telling it, no matter what it cost her. 6 weeks later, on a grey morning at O'Hare that felt to Katerina both achingly ordinary and impossibly significant, Caterina Conti and Lorenzo Conti boarded a flight to Rome under the careful, quiet supervision of a federal marshal who would shadow their transition for exactly as long as the international protection arrangement required, and not 1 day longer. Katerina looked out the window as Chicago fell away beneath the wing. The city, where she'd broken into a warehouse alone in the dark, where she'd fallen in love with a dangerous man across a candle-lit table, where she'd worn a wire against her own skin and nearly lost everything trying to hold two truths at once, and felt, for the first time in 15 months, the particular unfamiliar lightness of a person finally permitted to simply exist, without strategy, without fear, without the constant calculus of survival that had defined every single day since the night she'd first heard Lorenzo Camora's voice in the dark. "Ready?" Lorenzo asked, reaching for her hand as the plane levelled off above the clouds. "Ready," Katerina said, and meant it completely. For the first time, understanding that the word didn't mean unafraid. It meant simply willing. Willing to build something new from the wreckage of everything they'd survived. Willing to trust a love that had cost them both nearly everything, and given them, in exchange, something neither of them had quite dared to name until now. Rome, in late spring, smelled of jasmine and exhaust, and something underneath both that Katerina would come to understand over the following months as simply the smell of a city old enough to have survived everything and forgotten nothing. Their apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Trastevere, chosen deliberately for its narrow, anonymous streets and its distance from anywhere either of them had documented connections, became, slowly, almost unbearably ordinary, in the best possible way. Caterina sat for her Italian medical licensing exams 8 months after their arrival, passing with a score that earned her a position at a respected paediatric cardiology fellowship in a hospital 20 minutes from their front door. The specialty choice she'd quietly carried since the night Lorenzo first told her about Sophia, now finally given a name and a purpose of its own. Lorenzo built something slower, more careful, a small pharmaceutical consultancy that began, modestly, by helping 2 Roman hospitals modernize their supply chain verification systems. The exact skill set 15 years of building Meridian Pharma's war room had given him, now stripped entirely of the empire it had once served. It would never make him wealthy in the way the Camorra name once had. He did not seem to mind. They did not speak often about Chicago. The trial's aftermath continued to unfold from a distance, mediated through careful, infrequent communications with Marcus Webb, who called every few months with updates neither of them particularly wanted, but both felt obligated to receive. Tony's appeal denied, Dominic's parole hearing scheduled. The slow, methodical dismantling of an organisation that had once defined every hour of Lorenzo's life, now reduced to brief clinical phone calls in a language that felt increasingly like it belonged to someone else's history. "Do you miss it?" Katerina asked him once, 18 months into their new life. Lying together on the small terrace of their apartment, the Roman evening settling gold and warm around them. Any of it. The penthouse, the power, the version of yourself who walked into rooms and watched people go quiet. Lorenzo considered the question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything now. The performed confidence of his old life worn away entirely, replaced by something quieter and, Katerina thought, infinitely more genuine. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not the violence, never the violence. But there was a version of competence in that life. A sense of controlling something vast and dangerous, that this quieter version of myself sometimes misses. The way I imagine a soldier misses the clarity of combat, even while being grateful for peace." He turned to look at her, the last gold light catching the grey that had spread further through his hair over the past 2 years. "But then I remember what that competence actually cost. You, bound to a chair with a bruise on your jaw. Sophia, 6 years old, in a hospital bed I have spent 20 years trying not to remember in too much detail. Walter Hines's widow twisting a tissue into a wet rope in a family room I will think about for the rest of my life." His hand found hers, the gesture as natural now as it had been from the very beginning. "No, Katerina, I do not miss it. I miss, sometimes, the idea of who I thought I was inside it. But I have become someone better since I let it go, and that man, the one sitting here with you on this terrace in this ordinary, extraordinary life, is the only version of myself I have ever actually wanted to be." It was that autumn, 2 years and 4 months after their arrival in Rome, that Katerina received the envelope. It arrived through a careful chain of forwarding addresses Webb had helped establish, a final, formal closure to a chapter of her life she'd thought entirely finished. Her dissertation, revised and finally published in a peer-reviewed journal of pharmaceutical policy. The names redacted, as she'd promised herself in that warehouse over 3 years earlier. The real architects of the counterfeit drug network named and prosecuted. Lorenzo's role in both the crime and its dismantling preserved only in federal records, sealed for the protection of an ongoing witness program. The envelope contained a single printed copy of the published paper, a brief congratulatory note from her former attending, Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, who had somehow, through channels she chose not to investigate too closely, learned enough about her continued existence to send his genuine pride across an ocean and a new identity. She read the paper that evening on the terrace, Lorenzo beside her, watching the sun set over rooftops the colour of old terracotta, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognised, finally, as peace. Not the absence of everything they'd survived, but the slow, hard-won integration of it into a life that had room now for both grief and joy to coexist without either one consuming the other. "It's done," she said softly, setting the paper down. "All of it. Walter Hines, Loretta Vance, Dwight Okafor. Their families finally have the full truth, published, permanent, impossible to bury again. It's done, Lorenzo agreed, pulling her closer against his side, the city settling into evening around them, jasmine and old stone, and the particular gold light that made Rome feel, even after 2 years, like a place that had been waiting for them their entire lives. And we're still here, together, after everything that should have ended this story a dozen different ways. Katerina turned to look at him. This man who had once told her in a dark warehouse that he hadn't decided whether she was the bravest woman he'd ever met or the stupidest. This man who had handed her a key to his grandmother's apartment before either of them understood they'd need it. This man who had taken up arms for the first time in 15 years, not for power, but for her, and understood, with the particular clarity that only survives genuine difficulty, exactly what they had built together. "If you want to find me," she said, quoting back to him, softly, the words from a note that had once changed the entire shape of her life, though the context had long since transformed into something gentler. "You don't have to look very far anymore." "No," Lorenzo agreed, drawing her hand to his lips, the Roman evening deepening around them into the particular blue dark that belonged, now, entirely to the life they'd chosen together. "I never do."